Good morning and welcome to my talk on the Hollywood Repatriation Hospital, Perth. That's the main focus. If you hear our dog, miniature white schnauzer Winston, barking in the background, I apologise for that in advance. So here's a wonderful picture of the hospital in 1941 with the Red Cross on the roof and the flag flying, intended to try and protect it from any attack, as it were, and identify it as somewhere where those who are wounded and ill were being treated. Okay, this is a computer graphic picture of Hollywood Hospital today. It's quite extraordinary. This is the main emergency department at Hollywood Hospital. So as you can see, it's changed out of all recognition over the last few years. Just something on copyright. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but just to say the Society's purpose in reproducing images of these images and photographs is purely educational, that is to enhance community understanding of Australian and other nations' naval and military history. There is no intention on the part of the Society or Nigel Rogers to profit from this initiative. I just want to acknowledge a very important publication here where I got a lot of my information from. It's called Everyone's a Hero by Ros Davis, and it's the story of Hollywood Hospital and its history. And in fact, traditionally, it's always been handed out to every new nurse that started at Hollywood Hospital used to get a copy of this. I don't think it happens anymore for all sorts of reasons, as you can imagine, but it's a fantastic publication. So I acknowledge that I've used this as for reference and material, and the contents, some of the contents is what I quote from and so on. So as we approach Anzac Day, this presentation reminds us of the important role that hospitals have played in Australia to care for the sick and the wounded of our defence forces who've been involved in active combat service in war zones. The focus will be specifically on the history of the Hollywood Military Repatriation Hospital in Perth, Western Australia, which was first established in early 1941. The idea sort of originated when my wife Heather spent a fair amount of time in 2024 and this year as an inpatient at Hollywood Hospital. So she's been in and out of there so many times I've lost count. And we realised that the hospital has an interesting history from its original formation as a repatriation hospital in 1940. Whereas today it is now Australia's largest private hospital with some 900 beds covering the entire spectrum of medical needs. So I'm going to talk about the origins, the founding, the early history, the story behind the names of some of the wards and wings, which is quite fascinating. And it's interesting to me, the times I've been in and out of there, I've talked to some staff are very well informed about why a ward has a certain name or a wing has a certain name, but many others don't. That's not a criticism. It's just interests me that some people don't always understand what's behind the name and the origins of the wards and the wings and so on, which has a story in itself. And then we can cover some conclusions. So the origins and founding. In 1940, the Commonwealth Government of Australia allocated £3 million to build military hospitals throughout the nation to accommodate the sick and wounded returning from World War II. And from this amount, £40,000 was made available to Western Command for the construction of a 100-bed hospital in Perth, with a further £120,000 allocated to fit out and equip the hospital. And it's interesting, there were many general hospitals throughout World War II. Some were already established, and then became military hospitals. Others were built from scratch. So I'm just going to go through, there's so many of them. I'm not going to talk about each one in micro detail. You might recognize some of the names of these places, but I'm just going to put them up slowly. So Tamworth, Oldcombe Hills, the number indicates the sort of number assigned to the hospital. Bathurst, Daw Park, South Australia. And so we go on. This one specialised in tuberculosis. Pacapanel, Ballarat, Adelaide, and here's the one at Perth, Hollywood. It was number 110. Campbelltown, Greenslopes, Brisbane, Concord, Kenmore, Heidelberg, Victoria, a very famous hospital. And in fact, the one at Perth here was some ways modelled on that initially. So the list goes on. Mount Carmel, Toowoomba. This interesting one, Northam, then became, it was established at Rabaul and New Britain. Another one, here's 119. Sydney Showgrounds, Little Bay, New South Wales. General Hospital in Katherine, Northern Territory. This is another interesting one, number 128, Port Moresby, boatless inlet then from 1944. And this one's even more interesting. The number 130 was actually established in Japan at the end of the war. British Commonwealth Occupation Force set up a hospital there. Quite remarkable. So I'm going to quote a bit now from Everyone's a Hero. So the decision was made to model the design of number 110 Australian General Hospital on the pavilion-type building at the Heidelberg Military Hospital in Victoria. And plans for the Perth Hospital were prepared between September and December 1940 by Mr. Ron Ledger, who later became Principal Architect of the West Australian Branch Office of the Department of the Interior, and Mr. G.F. Glenham. The construction was overseen by the Department of the Interior and charged the Loan Fund War Services Military Subdivision. In having a central corridor with wards radiating outwards, the hospital layout was referred to as the spider design. With verandas on the northern side, its orientation made maximum use of the sun during the winter. Many of the open plan wards were partially two-storey, taking advantage of the site contours. The charge sister had an office and there was a kitchenette, together with ablution areas and storage spaces. Each patient had a small wooden locker in which to keep personal belongings, but there were no wardrobes in which to store clothes. They were considered unnecessary, as all patients were issued with Commonwealth pyjamas and a dressing gown for the duration of their stay. As soon as the plans were ready, the calling for tenders was expedited, and several building contractors began work in the early part of 1941. Specialist clinicians such as X-ray, pathologist, and physiotherapist staff were invited to confer with the architects so their particular requirements could be incorporated in the design. The main administration building facing Monash Avenue was built by W.H. Ralph and Sons of Bruce Street, Netherlands, the nurses' quarters by W. Fairweather, the Australian Army Medical Corps quarters by W. Giltrap, the boiler house, mortuary and wards 1, 2 and 3 by A.T. Bryan, and wards 4 and 5 and 6 by the West Australian Public Works Department. The boilers and hot water services were installed by P.J. Mapstone. Each contract was for a very short period of time, with stiff penalties for late completion. Shortage of copper pipe caused delays to most contracts, and a controversial decision was made to combine the fire and domestic water services on one ring main with a metered bypass of the domestic service to enable contractors to complete their contracts in reasonable time. The various contractors had difficulty in obtaining the services of tradesmen, most of whom had joined the armed forces. Eventually, it became necessary to temporarily release military personnel to cope with the situation. And the Director of Works, Mr. H.B. Sturtevant, was instrumental in seeking and obtaining their release. Also, contractors cooperated with one another in sharing the services of available tradesmen. There was a sort of major joint effort, and there, as I say, is the original plan. It's very different today. Today, it's a huge hospital. And here we see a picture of them clearing the site in early 1941, getting rid of the bush, and must have been hard work. There weren't huge mechanical diggers, and all the things that are available today would have been hard physical work in the West Australian sun and heat. So here is the approval to build Hospital 110 on Monash Avenue in Nedlands. I'll try and read it to you. You probably can't see it very clearly, but I'm staring at my screen. Memorandum for Western Command Hospital accommodation. I'm commanded to inform you that approval has been given for the erection at Perth of a 100-bed hospital at an estimated cost of £40,000, and a requisition, copy attached, has been forwarded to Department of the Interior for execution. The cost of this work will be chargeable to Loan Fund War Services, Army, and arrangements have been made for accounts to be submitted to your command for payment. The necessary finance authority was issued to your district finance officer on the 28th of March 1940. The objective number for works under this allotment is W17, signed Secretary of the Military Board. So let's just talk about some of the names of the wards and the wings, and there's lots of incredible stories around all of this. The hospital contains 4 wings: the Anne Leach wing, the Marjorie Brisley wing, the Vivian Bullwinkle wing, and we'll hear more about Vivian Bullwinkle shortly, and the Sylvia Perry wing. All wards and units are named after those with West Australian connections who were awarded either the Victoria Cross or the George Cross. It doesn't mean that they were necessarily born in WA, but they had a connection. Either were born there, they lived there, or they died there. So let's just start talking through some of the wards. Charles Pope Ward, there's lots of Victoria Crosses here. The Clifford Sadlier Ward, the Frederick Bell Unit, the George Goss Ward, Henry Murray Ward, Hugh Edwards Ward, we'll talk about Hughie Edwards later on, Jim Gordon Ward, James Woods Ward, John Carroll Ward, George Howell Ward, Lawrence McCarthy Ward. It's funny, I was talking with Heather the other day about how many wards she'd been in. She's been in the Lawrence McCarthy Ward. Thomas Axford Ward, the Mark Donaldson Ward, the Leon Goldsworthy Ward, George Cross, Leslie Starovich Ward, Martin O'Meara Ward, Heather was in that one, O'Meara Ward, Percival Gratwick Ward, Stan Gurney Ward, Arthur Baggott Ward, we'll be talking about Arthur in a minute, George Cross. Let's start talking about some of the stories behind the names of these wards, and I'm going to talk firstly about Sir Hughie Edwards. So, Sir Hughie Edwards, VC, KCMG, CB, DSO, OBE, DFC, born Fremantle, 1st of August 1914, died 5th of August 1982 at Darling Point, New South Wales. He started out as a stable hand. Used to take horses down to the beach, apparently, here in Perth. Factory labourer, airman, and then he became governor of Western Australia. He went to White Gum Valley State School and Fremantle Boys School. So Huey Idwell Edwards was a pilot with the Royal Australian Air Force and Britain's Royal Air Force, the RAF. He was Australia's most highly decorated serviceman in World War II. And as I mentioned, his long list of decorations included a Victoria Cross, Distinguished Service Order, and Distinguished Flying Cross. Quite amazing. He was a highly respected commander. He enjoyed a distinguished post-war career in the Air Force, business, and government. As I said, Edwards was born in Fremantle, in WA. A family called him Idwell, his Welsh name. His parents, Hugh and Jamie, were born in Wales. He came from a very, very modest background. Edwards left Fremantle Boys' School after completing his junior certificate. He found work at a horse racing stable and briefly joined the Australian Army. Edwards began training as a cadet, however, with the Royal Australian Air Force in July 1935. He was 21. While described as not a natural pilot, his teachers recorded him as above average when he graduated. We go to the war years. Edwards transferred to an RAF bomber squadron in 1936, and in May 1938 he survived a plane crash near Scotland, suffering head and leg injuries, and those were to affect him greatly for the rest of his life. But after several surgeries, Edwards joined a bomber crew 2 years later. He was determined to go back and fly, and Edwards was given command of number 105 Squadron in the UK. And he and his crew took part in several bombing raids over Germany and occupied Europe. And on the 4th of July, 1941, Edwards was part of a 12-bomber attack over the German city of Bremen. The raid was in full daylight with no cloud cover, leaving the Allied planes exposed to German anti-aircraft fire. All planes were hit, 4 were shot down. His own Blenheim bomber was hit more than 20 times, but Edwards managed to return to England. Edwards' gallantry and determination were recognised with a VC awarded on the 22nd of July 1941. The citation read, "On reaching Bremen, he was met with a hail of fire, all his aircraft being hit, 4 of them being destroyed. Nevertheless, he made a most successful attack, and then with the greatest skill and coolness, withdrew the surviving aircraft without further loss. Throughout the execution of this operation, which he had planned personally, with full knowledge of the risks entailed. Wing Commander Edwards displayed the highest possible standard of gallantry and determination." Edwards was involved also in many major aerial campaigns during the war, other ones. He received a series of promotions while serving in Northwest Europe, Malta, and Ceylon and Southeast Asia. He received other decorations for leadership and bravery, including a DSO. Edwards stayed with the RAF and held several senior positions. He led, in fact, British pilots during the Suez Crisis in 1956 and the Iraqi Revolution in 1958. In 1962, he was promoted to Director of Establishments of the Air Ministry in London. He held this position until his retirement from the RAF 18 months later. Edwards finally returned to Australia with his wife, Cherry. He took on a director's role in a large mining company in Sydney. Cherry died in 1956, and Edwards married Dorothy Carew Berwick 6 years later and moved to Western Australia as its governor. He was knighted during his term as state governor. Remarkable man. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about this man now, Lieutenant Charles Pope, Victoria Cross. and they're the famous Victoria Cross Medal for valour, as we know. So Charles Pope was an Australian recipient of the Victoria Cross. He received the Victoria Cross posthumously for his actions on the 15th of April 1917 on the Western Front at the Battle of Agincourt, which took place during the First World War. In fact, Heather stayed in the Charles Pope ward, and I used to read this story, talk to Heather about this story when she was in the hospital there. So amidst the backdrop of the First World War, Pope enlisted with the Australian Imperial Force on the 31st of August 1915, volunteering to serve overseas as part of Australia's commitment to the First World War. Assigned as a reinforcement to 11th Battalion, which had been formed largely of West Australians, was at the time fighting Gallipoli. After training, he was quickly made a sergeant. And by February 1916, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, and 4 months later sailed for England to join the battalion, which had transferred to Europe following its evacuation from Gallipoli, along with a batch of reinforcements. On December 9th, 1916, Pope arrived on the Western Front, reporting to the 11th Battalion, which was camped around Bezitain-le-Grand for the winter, having fought at Poitiers and Moucourt Farm early in the year. Later that month, he was promoted to lieutenant, and in early 1917, he attended the divisional school. Pope subsequently fought in actions around Flers, Le Bac, Ligny-Tillot, and on the 15th of April 1917 at Louveral in France, during the Battle of Agincourt, he was in command of a very important piquet post, with orders to hold it at all costs amidst a heavy German attack. The enemy, in greatly superior numbers, attacked and surrounded the post, and ammunition was running short. Pope, in a desperate bid to save the position, was seen to charge with his men into a superior enemy force, of which they were overpowered. Although heavy losses were inflicted, he had obeyed the order to hold out to the last, and his lifeless body, along with those of most of his men, were found amongst 80 enemy dead. Unbelievable story. So, Charles Pope. Okay, Captain Arthur Bagot, George Cross, Distinguished Service Cross, returned to the Navy now. And in fact, this is another ward that Heather was in, the Arthur Bagot ward. So, Arthur Gerald Bagot, George Cross, Distinguished Service Cross, was an Australian naval officer. He was an exchange recipient of the George Cross, the highest civil decoration for heroism in the United Kingdom and formerly in the Commonwealth. And in 1918, while serving as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve during the First World War, Bagot and Lieutenant Robin Hoare battled flames to remove depth charges from motor launch 356 after its engine room had exploded. The pair were credited with preventing a further explosion and thus potential casualties, was subsequently awarded the Albert Medal. But in 1971, the British government announced that the Albert Medal would be discontinued, and living recipients would henceforth be regarded as holders of the George Cross. The change came into effect from 21st of October, and living recipients were strongly invited to exchange their medals, and Bagot took up the offer. Bagot was actually born in Adelaide in South Australia, 26th of April 1888, and he died in Perth on the 12th of November 1979, aged 91. So he finally died in Perth. And there's one other interesting story about Bagot in relation to the Ostend raid, where he got his Distinguished Service Cross. Appointed second in command of Motor Launch 283, Bagot was in action at the first Ostend raid on the 23rd of April 1918. Throughout the operation, the launch conducted duties of rescuing officers and men from HMS Brilliant and Sirius. Praised for his great coolness under fire during the engagement, Bagot was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Notification of the award was published in a supplement to the London Gazette on the 23rd of July, 1918. So, Arthur Bagot. Right, let's move on. Lieutenant Colonel Vivian Bullwinkle, AO, MBE, the Florence Nightingale Medal, which is awarded by the Red Cross. And there's Vivian. Okay, let's talk about Vivian. In 1941, wanting to enlist for service in the Second World War, Vivian Bullwinkle volunteered as a nurse with the Royal Australian Air Force, but was rejected for having flat feet. She was, however, able to join the Australian Army Nursing Service, assigned to the 2nd 13th Australian General Hospital, 2nd 13th AGH. In September 1941, she sailed for Singapore. After a few weeks with the 2nd 10th AGH, Bullwinkle joined the 13th AGH in Johor Bahru. Japanese troops, as we know, invaded Malaya in December 1941 and began to advance southwards, winning a series of victories. And by late 1942, they were advancing through Johor, and the 13th AGH was to evacuate to Singapore. A short-lived defence of the island ended in defeat. And on the 12th of February, Bullwinkle and 65 other nurses boarded the SS Viner to escape. 2 days later, the ship was sunk by Japanese aircraft. Bullwinkle and 21 other nurses and a large group of men, women, and children finally made it ashore at Raji Beach on Banker Island. Others on board either went down with the ship or were swept away and were never seen again. The group were joined the next day by others, making a total of about 100, including about 20 English soldiers from another ship that had sunk earlier. They elected to surrender to the Japanese. An officer from the Viner Brook walked to Mantok, a town on the northwest side of the island, to contact the Japanese. While he was away, Matron Irene Drummond, the most senior of the Australian nurses, suggested that civilian women and children should start off walking towards Mantok. In an action that later became known as the Banker Island Massacre, Japanese soldiers came and killed the men, then motioned the nurses to wade into the sea. They then machine-gunned the nurses from behind. Bullwinkle was struck by a bullet which passed completely through her body, missing her internal organs, and feigned death until the Japanese soldiers left. She hid with the British Army Private Cecil George Kingsley of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps for 12 days in the jungle, tending to his severe wounds, only then realizing the extent of her own wound before being captured. They were taken into captivity, but Kingsley died soon after from his injuries, which included a gunshot wound in his abdomen. Now, Vivian survived the war, having been a prisoner of war, and she retired from the army in 1947. She became director of nursing at the Fairfield Infectious Diseases Hospital, and she devoted her life to the nursing profession, became president of the Australian College of Nursing. She died in Perth, aged 84, on July the 3rd, 2000. And in 2024, the Australian Electoral Commission proposed a new electorate in the lower house in Western Australia, and it's named Bullwinkle in her honour. Extraordinary woman. And here is a picture of Vivian Bullwinkle testifying before the War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo in 1947, supplied by the Australian War Memorial. So she gave evidence of what had happened on that beach. It's a horrendous story, very grim, but she testified as to what had happened because she was the sole survivor of this massacre. So the Vivian Bullwinkle So the Vivian Bullwinkle Wing at Hollywood is opened on the September 1998 by WA's Governor, His Excellency Major General Michael Jeffrey. And here at the entrance to the Bullwinkle Wing is this wonderful citation to Vivian with a picture of all her medals and a plaque of the opening. And believe it or not, Heather was in the Bullwinkle Wing only last week. So I looked at that again. So here's a wonderful poster from the period. Do a worthwhile job. Join the AAMWS, the Australian Army Medical Women's Service. Work with Australian Army medical units and help the sick and wounded soldiers back to health. Wonderful sort of period poster from the time. So let's move on to some conclusions. Moving towards the end, you'll all be able to get off to an early lunch on the East Coast, and we Sangropers can go back to drinking our coffee and tea. Hollywood Private Hospital has a proud history dating back to the 1940s, originally built during World War II by the Commonwealth Government as the 300-bed, 110 military hospital. Hospital was built, as we know, to care for servicemen and women. It was first occupied in 1941. In 1947, control of the hospital was passed to the Repatriation Commission to provide acute care for veterans and war widows and widowers. It became the Repatriation General Hospital, Hollywood. Then the Australian-owned company Ramsay Healthcare became the owner and operator on February the 24th, 1994, to create this extraordinary the Hollywood Private Hospital as it is today, this massive hospital with some 900 beds that treats everybody in every kind of medical area that you can name. Medical support is an absolutely critical combat multiplier of modern warfare. We know this. You've only got to think about Ukraine and what's going on there, terrible injuries that people are suffering. For the first line medical aid posts, then on to the second line, the field ambulance, casualty clearing station, then on to the third line, the military general hospitals if required. They all play a vital part in treating and rehabilitating wounded and injured ADF personnel. Australia can be very proud of its history in this area, of the devotion and dedication of all medical and nursing staff concerned, that has resulted in top world-class standards being achieved. Lest we forget. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Yeah, fascinating. It's just quite amazing to know that we've got that many heroes and all one hospital, or the number of wards there are that you can actually name them all. Just wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you for just touching on those few that we've heard about. No doubt the stories from all the others are equally fascinating and heroic.
Exactly. No, thank you, David.